Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at our next candidate up for the 2028 series, and that is none other than former presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. We already did Cory Booker, and we're now going to continue with another member of that crowded 2020 Democratic presidential primary with the former mayor of South Bend. In today's video, we're going to grade Buttigieg on our rubric. We're going to talk about his path to victory on the electoral map. But first, we're going to give some context on who he is and what he's done politically in the past. So let's look at the last time that Pete Buttigieg ran for the last office he held, last elected office he held, which was mayor of South Bend, Indiana. As you can see, this is a pretty mid-sized city. And given that Buttigieg ran in off-year mayoral elections and he had pretty anemic turnout, he only was able to win by getting 8,000 to 10,000 votes in these races. It's not a knock on him, but it does show the extent to which his elections were kind of among smaller groups of voters. He was never a governor or a senator or even the mayor of a truly big city. Nonetheless, he has the somewhat enviable distinction for Democrats of being a progressive or at least a Democrat in a red state. South Bend is obviously not a Republican city. It's actually more of a college town, but nonetheless, it's in a state like Indiana that is conservative, and it is in a very important part of the country politically, that being the Midwest. Now, Pete Buttigieg, of course, ran for president in 2020, and we'll talk about that. But it's important to understand that, excuse me, he also, after serving as mayor of South Bend for 2 terms, was appointed to be the Secretary of Transportation under President Biden, and he served in that role. And obviously was kind of a more well-known cabinet figure, both due to his previous run for president, name recognition based on that, as well as the fact that transportation became a key issue for the Biden legislative agenda, especially during the first part of his term when he had a majority in the House. So overall, Buttigieg got a lot of exposure, really dating back to 2019 when he first jumped in the race for president. But what you may not know about him is that he actually ran for treasurer of Indiana back in 2010. He was very young. Back then, he was one of the youngest candidates to run for a statewide position like treasurer ever, and he did not win, unfortunately for him. He lost decisively to Richard Murdoch, who actually ended up losing a Senate race in 2012, just 2 years later. Nonetheless, Buttigieg, obviously, in 2011, ran for mayor of South Bend for the first time, and he won and he really made a political career out of it. So I guess this goes to show that he was able to recover and not really let that early loss, the first loss of his political career, define him. Now, let's talk about to me, the most relevant indicator of Pete Buttigieg's political acumen and ability, which is the 2020 Democratic primary. This primary was obviously a really crowded primary. It was unbelievably stacked with so many candidates, right? And Pete Buttigieg did a very good job of making a lane for him. I mean, he was the mayor of a small town, or I should say a mid-sized city. It's not a small town. South Bend isn't, but on the national stage, it's rare to see a guy go from being mayor of a city of that size to being nominee for president of the United States by a major political party. But nonetheless, Buttigieg, of course, did go from having basically no national name recognition to being a front runner by the end of the primary. He actually won the Iowa caucus very narrowly over Bernie Sanders, as many of you know. And overall, even though he didn't win that primary, I thought that he ran one of the best campaigns, just given that on top of just totally rising in name recognition, he was able to really create a pretty big base of supporters, even those who didn't vote for him. There are a lot of Democrats who really respect Pete Buttigieg, really like Pete Buttigieg, despite the fact that they maybe voted for Joe Biden or voted for Elizabeth Warren or someone else in the primary. And so that's relevant. Now, if we look at this polling from the primary, you can kind of see the average compiled from all the from all the various surveys that were taken going back to the beginning of 2019. And you can see Buttigieg, just to kind of show you on your screen, Buttigieg was this yellow color down here. He started out basically with no support. I mean, he wasn't even in the first, few polls by March of 2019. He was at 3 to 4%. And he peaked, if you look at near December, he was at nearly 10%. And he was getting pretty substantial support. He was rising before he dropped out of the race, of course, and he won the Iowa caucuses. That was, to me, incredibly impressive for a couple of reasons. First of all, Iowa in the Democratic primary is Bernie Sanders territory. Why is that? Well, Bernie Sanders in 2016 especially did remarkably well with rural white voters and with working class white voters, and that was a demographic that he really, his support among those voters, I should say, was kind of an omen of what was to come for Hillary Clinton in the general election when she lost to Donald Trump and did poorly across the Midwest in states like Iowa. And in 2020, a lot of people talk about how Bernie Sanders lost some support among those voters. He lost, he kind of his big advantage with rural white voters who were in the Democratic primary. He lost his advantage with many working class voters in the Democratic primary. And obviously, that kind of, those voters kind of dispersed. They didn't all go to one candidate. Some of them stuck with Bernie, but those who left, some of them went to Biden. Some of them, went to, I think to a smaller extent, you had some of them supporting Elizabeth Warren. But a number of them, especially in Iowa, went to Pete Buttigieg. Now, I don't exactly know what caused that to happen directly, but I do know that if you look at the Iowa caucuses and you see where Buttigieg got his support, a lot of it came in the suburbs, which is certainly relevant. But he did very well in a number of rural counties. You're going over to this kind of streak in the middle of the state, especially out here, you have a number of counties that Pete Buttigieg won that were very rural, that had been Bernie Sanders territory. I mean, like if you go back to 2016, Bernie Sanders, the Green, he won a lot of these counties in the western part of the state. And especially at this point in 2016, he wasn't even considered to be close to Hillary Clinton. Obviously, he gained momentum heading into 2016, but he wasn't even close to Hillary Clinton in terms of the conventional wisdom. And yet, in 2016, he was competitive in those areas, and a lot of them flipped to Pete Buttigieg in 2020. Some of that came from vote splitting from Biden, sure, which, Biden obviously hurt Bernie Sanders, especially the working class voters. But Pete Buttigieg really did a great job of compelling these voters and getting them to his side. And that's no small feat, by the way, because that ultimately, I think, tanked the campaign of Sanders, who, although he did better with Hispanic voters, notably in 2020 than 2016, he lost key primaries like Michigan, especially because he was not able to put up the same numbers as the working class voters, even when Buttigieg wasn't even on the ballot, by the way. So Buttigieg was a really important figure, and even though he didn't win that primary, the two takeaways I want you to have are, number one, that Buttigieg went from being a no-name to being a top contender, and number two, that he played a real role in helping Joe Biden win that primary. Obviously, he endorsed him when he dropped out, as well as kind of taking away some support from Bernie Sanders in the earlier states like Iowa. And so that's the really important thing about Pete Buttigieg. Now, when we talk more about his appeal now, I think Buttigieg is a really good candidate, especially among Democrats for the suburbs, right? Just taking a look at where he did well in Iowa back in 2020. Obviously, he's the yellow color here. He didn't do all that great in the metro areas. A lot of it came for Biden, Sanders, and to an extent Warren in Johnson County. But in Des Moines, Buttigieg held up pretty well. And if you look at the crosstabs of the polls that were conducted in January and February 2020, he was polling best among white educated voters. He and Warren, actually, ironically, although being a bit kind of divergent ideologically, he and Warren occupied much the same constituency, which was educated white voters in the suburbs, maybe, between the ages of 30 and 50, who are left-leaning. That's why they're registered Democrats, but maybe not as left-leaning as Bernie Sanders. And so for Pete Buttigieg to win over that demographic, that's huge for him. That means he has a real chance in the Democratic primary, because Democrats are increasingly the party of white, suburban, college-educated voters. Now, the other demographic that has been key in deciding Democratic primaries in recent years has been black voters. And black voters really helped Joe Biden win the 2020 Democratic primary. That's why I think he was the president from 2021 to 2025, was off the back of black voters. And black voters have not been particularly friendly to Pete Buttigieg in his run for president, I should say. A lot of it comes from some scandals that he had as mayor of South Bend. But broadly, we've just seen that Buttigieg has been unable to achieve support from black voters. Even back in 2010, when he ran for treasurer, obviously a lot of it wasn't his fault because he was running with other Democrats on the same ballot. But Buttigieg didn't fare all that well in majority black precincts in Indianapolis, as well as some other urban areas such as Gary up north. And that's kind of it's a very small result. It's a random race for like a down ballot office in a state. But it's interesting because it kind of is in line with the pattern from 2020, which was that Buttigieg was unable to achieve good support among black voters. He was consistently at 1% to 2% with black voters in most crosstabs, losing them decisively to figures like Joe Biden. That's ultimately why Buttigieg couldn't compete. If you look at the South Carolina Democratic primary, back in 2020, and you see how Buttigieg did. He didn't win a single county, and it wasn't even close. I mean, he didn't even come within the top three. He got less than 10% of the vote. He did worse than Tom Steyer, who was at no point more competitive than Buttigieg in that primary. So Buttigieg really harmed himself by being unable to appeal to black voters. And I think that is kind of where we talk about his biggest weakness from an electoral perspective. Now, it's time that we pull out the rubric and look at what grades we're going to give him, because I think this is a good segue into that. So, as you can see, I'm harsh to Pete Buttigieg in a number of these areas. Now, obviously, these categories are weighted differently. The top ones are more important than the bottom ones, but that doesn't work to Buttigieg's benefit. It actually hurts him a little bit the way that I have this weighted. So I'll take you through it. I'll talk about what these categories mean, as I always do, just in case you aren't familiar with the series, and I'll explain my reasoning. So the first, just to get into it, is coalition building, which is worth a quarter of all total points. It's the most important category. And it basically asks the question of, does the candidate expand the party in a meaningful way, right? You can read the bullets on your screen. I'm not going to read them out to you. But what I'm basically saying here is that I don't think Buttigieg is really that great at expanding the Democratic Party's tent. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, his main demographic is a group that's been trending towards Democrats a lot in recent elections, which is good for turnout among the base in a primary, but not all that important for winning a general election, right? White, educated voters in the suburbs were pretty good for Kamala Harris in 2024. She didn't lose that election because she did that poorly with white, educated, suburban voters, right? At least between the ages of 30 and 50. She did have some slippage among some suburban voters, especially voters between the ages of 45 and 65. But that's a conversation for another time. The voters that are supporting Pete Buttigieg in the Democratic primary voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. That's not, to me, that's not a huge electoral problem for Democrats to address. But he does have another problem, which is that he's been unable to appeal to black voters. And that's kind of my segue into this, because Democrats need black voters to win. In 2024, even though Kamala Harris polled reasonably well with black voters in terms of approval rating and in terms of support among black Democrats, black turnout, especially in states like North Carolina, was not good enough for her. It was lower than 2020. It was actually lower than 2016 in most cases. And even in 2016, Hillary Clinton didn't come that close to winning North Carolina or a state like Georgia, where Democrats have really benefited from black turnout. So that is a key part of the coalition that Buttigieg actually doesn't really have a lot of appeal to. Then the other thing is reaching out to newer disaffected voters. Now, as I talk about later in this video, Pete Buttigieg, I think, is actually a very good speaker. I think he's a good debater, but he hasn't really shown an ability to bring new people into the tent. He didn't in 2020, and he didn't really in his limited runs for office locally in Indiana. So I don't think he's bad, horrible enough for me to give him a 1, but he's to me weaker than someone like Booker or Bashir, just because he doesn't have a constituency that he clearly is uniquely strong with, at least that isn't already well within the grasp of the Democratic Party. Now, our next category is going to be electoral value, which is pretty simple. It's just, do you come from a swing state or do you benefit a swing state uniquely? Indiana will not be competitive with Buttigieg on the ballot. He might get a little mini hometown boost in South Bend, but that's not anywhere near enough to get Democrats to be close to winning Indiana's electoral votes. So the question then becomes, does he appeal uniquely anywhere else? Does he widen the path to 270 by expanding the battleground? And I've already established he doesn't expand the coalition, so I don't think he's going to expand the battleground. But I also don't think he's very strong in Michigan or in Wisconsin or in Pennsylvania or even in a state like Ohio or Iowa, which could in theory be competitive but probably won't be. So I don't view him as being a great guy for the Rust Belt. I don't think he's the worst candidate for the Rust Belt, but he certainly there's not a lot of evidence that he would fare all that well in a state like Michigan. In Michigan especially, Buttigieg actually has moved to Michigan. He's no longer resident of Indiana. He's moved to Michigan, and he actually considered running for Senate earlier this year, but ultimately decided not to, I think in part because polling was so bad. He was losing in most Michigan Senate polls. So we actually have evidence that Buttigieg would not be that good of a candidate for a state like Michigan. Now, the next is narrative coherence, and this is where Buttigieg, I think, excels. He's a good speaker. I think he has a good story, right, especially considering he served in the Army. And he's also a really good, I think, just raw speaker. He isn't super emotional and captivating in the same way as other speakers like Barack Obama or even Kamala Harris. But I do think that he is clear, that he is compelling, and especially in settings like interviews or debates, he does really well at seeming reasonable. And I think even a lot of Republicans would probably concede this. I think he's a disciplined messenger as well. And I think that if he ran a presidential campaign, he'd probably be good at staying on message. So I'll give him a pretty high score for that. The only thing I'm docking him for and not giving him a 7 for is because I don't think that he has an ability to develop messages that are new or that can expand the tent. But I've already talked about why I don't think that's going to happen. Charismatic sustainability, I think Buttigieg is pretty middle of the road here. I don't at all think that he energizes a super diverse range of voters across the party. I think his constituency is pretty clear. As I've said, it's white, educated, suburban voters. So I think he'd do a bit more, I don't think he'd be all that great for energizing black voters or bringing back working class voters to the Democratic Party. But I do think that he is a decent name brand. Like I said, I think him being a good speaker and being an effective communicator would probably help the party to a certain extent, but it's not enough to boost his score here that much. Now, record to run on. This is where I think Buttigieg runs into a lot of problems. I don't think he has a lot of political experience in the sense that he hasn't really won that much. I did praise his 2020 campaign. I will stand by that. I think it was a good campaign, like I said, but he's the highest office he's held by election is mayor of a mid-sized city in Indiana. So, it'd be a different thing if he was the governor of Indiana or if he had won a Senate race before, but he hasn't done any of those things. So I don't think that he has a strong electoral track record. And then in terms of, his political track record for him to run on personally, right, as mayor of South Bend, I listened to basically all of the 2020 Democratic primary debates. I've listened, I'm obviously someone who takes this very seriously, and I can't tell you the narrative that Buttigieg brought to the table from South Bend. I can tell you what he brought to the table from a perspective of why you should vote for him, but I can't tell you what he accomplished in South Bend that he wanted to take to the country as a whole. And maybe Buttigieg said something like that I missed, but I'm a pretty, I don't say this to toot my own horn, but I think it's objectively true. I'm a pretty engaged voter. I listen to candidates a lot, more than the average American does. And if I don't know what Buttigieg did as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, that he'd bring to America as a whole, I think most voters don't either, unfortunately. Maybe it's false, my head's in the sand. I'm wrong about a lot of things, but I think at the end of the day, it's an important thing to understand. Now, resource mobilization. Buttigieg is good at this, objectively. He fundraised really well in 2020, even as, he kind of was coming out of the woods. And his operations for turnout and with volunteers were pretty solid as well. I don't really see any problems with this. My only thing is that he did kind of flop in South Carolina at the end. He needed to be more competitive there. That's why I knock him down from a 7. But this is a high 6. I'll give him that. And then lastly, battlefield experience and resilience. Now, I know that my criticism of Buttigieg for not holding a ton of elected office beyond being mayor is valid for this. That's why I knocked him down a point. But beyond that, he's very good at this. I think in debates he's been good. He kind of had an awkward moment he had a lot of awkward moments with Amy Klobuchar back in 2020. Those two didn't like each other. It was kind of funny, I guess you could say, just because they were ideologically quite similar, but they really did not get along. Nonetheless, beyond that, as I've said it again, or I've said it before, I'll say it again. He's a good speaker, pretty good debater, and I think that if we threw a hard topic at him in a debate against J.D. Vance, I think he'd handle it pretty well, just based on what we've seen from him in primaries, debates, and interviews. So overall, once you adjust for the weighting, he gets a 395, which is not terrible, right? He's still getting over 56% of all points, so he's doing more right than wrong, but it's lower than what we've seen from other candidates. It's lower than Beshear. It's certainly also lower than Cory Booker as well. So that means that when we look at our list of the 3 candidates we've done so far, we've done Beshear, then we did Booker, now we've done Buttigieg. As you can see, Beshear is still in the lead, but Booker is behind him by a considerable amount. But in a pretty distant last, we see Pete Buttigieg, and that's mostly because Buttigieg doesn't really shine in the most important categories. I don't think he does that well at building the coalition or adding value to the electoral map. There's some small things he does well, like organizing a campaign and speaking in high pressure atmospheres or environments. But I just think at the end of the day, some things are more important than others, and I think Buttigieg does kind of the cool stuff well, but he doesn't do the simple stuff right. Andy Beshear is someone who's from a red state who's been able to appeal to conservative voters. Pete Buttigieg has never shown that. Cory Booker has won Senate races in a state that's getting more and more competitive. Pete Buttigieg has not shown that at the end of the day. And so, in light of that, it's important that we now talk about Buttigieg's path to 270 on the electoral map to kind of illustrate why I think he's a bit weaker of a candidate. So as you can see, I've taken out all the states that are could potentially be remotely competitive. I do not consider Virginia and Florida to be competitive at this point. I'm open to changing that, but for now, I'm calling it as I see it. But if these 2 or 3 electoral votes that are going to be decisive, we can see where Pete Buttigieg is going to do well and where not going to do well. I expect that he would probably hold on to New Hampshire and Maine. These are states that are very white and more college educated than the nation as a whole. I think Buttigieg would hold up decently well with these demographics. I also think he'd hold on to Minnesota for a pretty similar reason, although I don't think he'd do all that well with working class voters, so probably wouldn't be by that big of a margin. And I think just by virtue of kind of partisanship, he'd hold on to New Mexico, but that would kind of be closer than expected. A lot of it comes down to how Buttigieg does with Hispanic voters, especially in urban areas, rather. And Buttigieg did okay with them in the polls in 2024, but we didn't really see him, do all that well in Nevada, right? Which is a really big test for Democrats among Hispanic voters. So he's at 211, and I think he'd probably win Nebraska second as well. So it's really 212. But beyond this, it's tricky. Now, New Jersey would be the natural next step for a Democrat, as Kamala Harris won this state. But Pete Buttigieg did not fare all that well with black voters in that primary, and New Jersey Democrats rely on good black turnout, especially in urban areas, to win. I think Buttigieg would ultimately win New Jersey, but I wouldn't be that confident in it. I think it'd actually probably be more narrow than 2024, which was already pretty narrow for Democrats. And so that kind of shows where Buttigieg's struggles really lie. I think he'd have a really hard time winning North Carolina or Georgia because of that. And the same goes for like harder states like Texas or Kansas or Nebraska's first district or Alaska, as well as Iowa and Ohio, even though I think he'd do okay in these states. But I think because he'd lose these two, he'd really have to win through the Rust Belt, right? And Arizona's already a pretty red state. So, and I don't think Buttigieg would expand the tent that much in Arizona either. Democrats have a pretty diverse coalition there. They need a lot of support among black and especially Hispanic voters. I don't think Buttigieg gives me any reason to believe in that. So Buttigieg has to win through the Rust Belt, and it's definitely possible. I could see him taking Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and winning the presidency, but he doesn't really have a lot of upside. And like, let's assuming he loses Nevada, this is to me like his realistic best case electoral map. Now, obviously, on a really good night, he can maybe win Nevada or Arizona. But like beyond that, you can see that he's pretty limited as a candidate. Just based on how he did in the primary last time he ran for president, it doesn't seem like he has enough support outside of his key constituencies to win. And that's what I keep coming back to. I know I'm very repetitive with this, but it's very true. And the reason that Joe Biden won in 2020 was because he was able to appeal to a number of different blocks. He did really well with suburban white voters, but he also had really good support among black voters, especially in states like Georgia. And he also held up okay with Hispanic voters. Now, Biden didn't do all that well with Hispanic voters, but he did just well enough with them to narrowly take Arizona and hold on to Nevada. And Buttigieg, I think, is weaker than Biden with all of those demographics, except for maybe white suburban voters, which will help him to an extent, but it's not enough to win. But that demographic is not enough to win you Michigan or win you Wisconsin. And it's certainly not enough to win you Georgia or North Carolina. So that's what I think would happen if Buttigieg were to run for president and he were able to win. But I think more realistically, he'd probably be losing these red states. And I think he'd be at a pretty clear disadvantage in these Rust Belt states as well, just because even though he'd potentially fare well in like the Milwaukee suburbs or in the Detroit suburbs, he'd need good black turnout and he'd need to kind of stop the bleeding in rural areas. And Democrats like Andy Beshear could potentially pull that off. Maybe Cory Booker, although I think Cory Booker is more reliant on progressive turnout. Buttigieg doesn't have either of those things going for him. So I think he'd probably lose, even though his best bet would be through the Rust Belt. So that's what I think about him overall. He's not, to me, the greatest candidate for Democrats from a purely electability standpoint. I know a lot of Democrats really like him. I understand why. But, his debating and his communication skills only get him so far. So that's where I rate him. He's so far the lowest of the 3 candidates we've graded. Again, I don't do this off my opinion of him as a candidate or of any candidate, but that's just how I see it in terms of electability. So please let me know what you think. Let me know what you expect from Buttigieg if he's even going to run in 2028, and I'll talk to you all next time.